and welcome to the August 24 edition of the NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series. And happy National Water Quality Month. My name is Laura Crowell, and I'm a Natural Resources Communications Specialist with the USDA NRCS. We host this webinar series to provide key findings, data, and tools to support agricultural producers, conservation partners, and researchers in pursuing voluntary conservation efforts across the nation. We will get started with today's presentation in just a moment. First, a few logistics. If you would like to receive email notifications with information on upcoming webinars, you may do so by following the instructions on the screen. A direct link to access GovDelivery's subscription webpage will also be available in the meeting chat and is provided at the top of the NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. If you're having problems with audio, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help. It may also help to leave and re-enter this webinar session. You may access live captions during the webinar by clicking the three dots with the word "More" on the meeting screen. This will enable you to select the Turn on Live Captions function. You can find resources from today's event on our Conservation Outcomes webinar webpage. The recording of this webinar and the presentation slides should be posted there by the end of August. We encourage everyone to type questions or comments into the chat throughout today's presentation. We will address as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the event. If we do not get to your question, or you do have follow-up thoughts, please email me at laura.crowell@usda.gov. With that, it's time to get started. It's my privilege to welcome Casey Taylor, NRCS Regional Conservationist for the Northeast, who will introduce today's topic and our speaker. During her NRCS career, Casey has worked in several states, beginning in Kansas as a student trainee and advancing to positions in Arkansas and Minnesota. Most recently, she was the Delaware State Conservationist. Regional Conservationist Taylor, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Laura, for the introduction. I'm honored to be here to kick off today's webinar about the important topic of legacy phosphorus. Phosphorus is a critical nutrient required for crop production, but when it ends up in our water, it can trigger unwanted changes to aquatic systems, such as the harmful algae blooms. It can also accumulate in our soils, wetlands, and streams over time. That's why for producers and conservationists, testing the soil and managing today's additions of phosphorus in fertilizer and manure is just the first important step. The smart nutrient management helps us to stop additional phosphorus runoff from becoming legacy phosphorus. It includes the 4 R's for nutrient stewardship: the right source, the right method, the right rate, and the right timing, and emphasizes the additional assessment of comprehensive site-specific conditions. Addressing legacy phosphorus requires targeted conservation in the fields, at the edge of fields, and more specifically in the watersheds. And it often requires new approaches to conservation implementation. Understanding these new approaches for reducing the impacts of legacy phosphorus is important to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, so we can offer the right practices and financial assistance opportunities to our farmers and those respective communities. As the Regional Conservationist for the Northeast, my states include several of the 5 basins which are part of USDA's the Multi-Year Conservation Effects Assessment Project, CEAP, the Legacy Phosphorus Assessment Project, or the topic for today's webinar. These basins include the Chesapeake Bay, Lake Champlain, Lake Erie, Mississippi River, and the Snake River. CEAP is a multi-agency effort led out by NRCS, who partners with USDA's Agricultural Research Service and offers and others to quantify conservation outcomes and support data-driven conservation decisions making across the working lands. CEAP collaborates with our science partners and federal agencies and members of academia, such as today's presenters, to assess the outcomes of voluntary conservation efforts over time and strengthening the science-backed data-driven decision-making. There are many ongoing SEAP watershed projects helping us better understand how to reduce phosphorus losses and more specifically, reduce water quality impacts. These include both water scale studies and edge of field monitoring to document the conservation outcomes and evaluating innovative conservation practices and stacking of those conservation practices. We're developing out watershed planning tools to help identify where this innovative conservation can be effectively implemented. The Conservation Outcomes webinar series provides an opportunity to share SEAP findings with you, our conservation colleagues and partners, researchers, agricultural producers, and additional land managers. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Pete Kleinman of the USDA Agricultural Research Service. He is the lead of USDA's Legacy Phosphorus Assessment Project. Pete is a soil scientist with USDA ARS in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he serves as the research leader for the Soil Management and Sugar Beet Research Unit. He previously worked 22 years with USDA ARS in State College, Pennsylvania, where he focused on the nutrient management issues related to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. He's been engaged in the SEAP watershed since 2004. He was a founding member of the Long-Term Agroecological Research Network and the past member of the Chesapeake Bay's Program Science and Technology Advisory Committee. He's also a fellow of the Soil and Water Conservation Society, the American Society of Agronomy, and the Soil Science Society of America. And he recently received the Hugh Hammond Bennett Award for Conservation from the Soil and Water Conservation Society. Dr. Kleinman also serves as the incoming chair of the Multi-State Research and Extension Group, and that's SERA, SERA-17, working on innovative solutions to minimize phosphorus losses from agriculture. Lisa Duranchik, who is the NRCS leader for the SEAP watershed assessments, will moderate the questions following Dr. Kleinman's presentation. Again, thank you for joining us. We look forward to your feedback and collaboration, but more specifically to our presentation from Dr. Kleinman. Dr. Kleinman, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Casey. And let me fire up my PowerPoint presentation. So it's a real pleasure to speak to you today in the Conservation Outcomes webinar. We're going to hone in on the element phosphorus, as Casey mentioned. And we're going to look at a dimension of phosphorus, a real pesky dimension of phosphorus that we refer to as legacy phosphorus. So the title of today's talk is Yesterday's Phosphorus, Today's Water Quality, Conservation Insights from the USDA Legacy Phosphorus Assessment. I'll note right off the bat that I am one of a member of a large team that includes USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, USDA Agricultural Research Service, university, and other partners. And so hopefully at the end, we'll be able to sufficiently acknowledge those who contribute to this. We're 3 years into a 5-year project, and this is a mature topic. And so a lot of the conclusions are ones I think that are certainly ready to present at this point. So I'm going to jump right in on legacy phosphorus. So just bear with me and we'll define it as we go along. But first, I just want to basically point out that legacy phosphorus it's a concern to conservation from the standpoint of individual practices and also from the larger aggregate from programs itself. So I'm going to start with an example of a practice. So this is wetland restoration, and I've got a couple of actually older studies here just to highlight where legacy phosphorus pops in. So Klamath Lake, Oregon, there was a wetland restoration project that in which folks looked at the potential outcome of wetland restoration. So wetlands offer all kinds of ecosystem services, including pollution mitigation. In this case, in looking at the soils that were being restored, these were agricultural soils, the authors here found the real potential for a significant dissolved phosphorus release during the wetting process, so the return of agricultural land to the wetland site. So that's legacy phosphorus. I mentioned dissolved phosphorus here. Dissolved phosphorus is that phosphorus that sits in the solution. It sits in the water. It's not attached to any particles or sediment, and it's the most bioavailable. And so it has the greatest impact with regard to the forms of phosphorus that we have out there. So another study here going across the pond to Denmark, where there were several very large wetland restoration projects that were put into play, in which the pollution mitigation was a real expectation of the outcome of wetland restoration. So the graph here illustrates basically on an annual basis the net either retention by the wetland or loss. So the loss being if more phosphorus is leaving the wetland that was coming in from upstream. And what you see for one of these wetlands is that 1 year you had some retention of phosphorus, the other you had significant loss, and then for the store A wetland, the other one, you really only had losses. Those losses were attributed to a variety of processes, but the source of it was actually phosphorus that was in the system already, so legacy phosphorus. So here's basically legacy phosphorus is a concern for the performance of a practice. When you look at a program, I spent a significant amount of time in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay has long been a priority since really the 1960s. Starting around 2010, you had significant uptick in activities to really address sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus loads to the Chesapeake Bay coming out of its 64,000 square mile watershed. And so if you break the watershed up into smaller watersheds, what we call HUC 8 or Hydrologic Unit Code 8 watersheds, they're still pretty large. You can do a form of accounting, and this accounting actually originated with NRCS. So Bob Kellogg, later Noah Golahan, really helped using various statistics, including from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, to do input and output at these larger scales. And so when you balance what's coming in for agriculture at this HUC 8 level versus what's going out, you see hotspots these that highlight themselves across the watershed. Those hotspots are associated with various things. We'll get into this a bit later on, but they show areas in which the system itself is out of balance with regard to phosphorus. And so as a result has quite a bit stored up. And so at a system level, crudely, that can be referred to as legacy phosphorus. And so just to hone in on two watersheds that contrast. So on the west side of the bay here, you see over time the change in phosphorus loads that's occurring, both observed, so as part of the very well-developed monitoring program that exists in the Bay watershed, and then modeled. The Chesapeake Bay model, which is loosely called, it's no longer called that, is used very much to drive the conservation efforts there. And what you see is the model and the monitoring align, and you see a significant reduction in the phosphorus load that's coming out of the Patuxent River on the west side of the bay. When you go to the east side of the bay, the Choptank River, so on the Delmarva Peninsula where the Choptank River watershed is located, you've got about, say, 8% of the nation's broiler poultry litter that are raised in that area. There's a lot of poultry chickens that are raised there. There's a lot of poultry litter. I've done this Freudian slip a couple of times now. That's where my mind goes when I think about chickens in particular, is to the litter. But what you have is a very significant contribution from historical application of poultry litter to the phosphorus in the soils that are there that can contribute to the diffuse pollution or the non-point source pollution there. So when you look at the trends over time, you see first that the Chesapeake Bay model anticipates significant reductions in phosphorus loadings associated with the implementation of conservation practices in particular. But with the monitoring, you see an uptick. And so this points to legacy phosphorus as both a problem with regard to questioning whether or not our practices are actually effective at addressing the issue, and also whether or not our models are capable of adequately anticipating the contributions of legacy phosphorus. So hopefully I've justified a bit why USDA has significantly invested in the legacy phosphorus assessment. So legacy phosphorus assessment introduced already. It's got 7 different sites that are part of the Conservation Effects Watershed Assessment Project. And they're basically all sites that are in watershed where legacy phosphorus has been identified as a concern. And the project itself crudely, incorporates 3 different sets of objectives. There's a measurement side, so the teams are going out and looking at sources and processes associated with legacy phosphorus on site, generating empirical data for that. There's a modeling side. Today I'm going to talk about the edge of field modeling that's there. We also have ongoing watershed modeling that's there. And then there's a management side. And so I'm going to conclude today really looking at the management aspects, the conservation practices, and the system level concerns. So what is legacy phosphorus? I've kind of talked about why we care about it. So I'd say it's actually loosely, it's a definition that's still evolving. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But in its broadest sense, it's basically phosphorus that's out there in the environment that's from historical human activities. And so that phosphorus can be in agriculture from the past application of commercial fertilizers or of manures. If you're in a grazing context, it can be as a result of the redistribution and concentration of nutrients associated with grazing animals. It can also be that phosphorus that's moved around in a watershed. So phosphorus that was relocated as a result of erosion or sedimentation, runoff deposition, and groundwater, stormwater. Legacy phosphorus even applies to kind of pre-industrial societies. And so I've got an image here that depicts the development of a midden at a Native American settlement. Those middens actually can be detected by going out and doing soil sampling and looking for phosphorus that remains, a signature of that concentration of waste in one location. So legacy P is anthropogenic. It's phosphorus that hasn't been removed by our harvested commodities. It is not phosphorus that is found in place naturally. And it's not the phosphorus that we plan to apply. That's not legacy phosphorus. And so it's important again to keep that in mind. A lot of the practices that we have involve planning, conservation planning. And so legacy P is more a remnant of the past. And as a result, it tends to be a little slippery with regard to bringing it into our conservation efforts. So legacy phosphorus isn't just about bad management. And I think this is a very important lesson that I'm going to drive home throughout the day. Legacy phosphorus is actually just a function of the way that we manage things, even under best practices. And so I've given some examples here from precision management to riparian buffers, to the injection of manures, all of which are best practices that we want to see out there adopted, but they don't necessarily address the full issue of legacy phosphorus. And in fact, sometimes they can surprisingly be a source of that legacy phosphorus. So we'll get into that. So legacy phosphorus is not something to ignore or just assign to a bad actor. So where do we find legacy phosphorus? Well, from an agricultural perspective, it really begins with the fertilization of our soils. So absolutely, we find it in our soils. I'll be talking a lot about that today. It occurs in our streams, in our floodplains. You find it basically in areas of deposition behind dams, behind impoundments and reservoirs. It can also be found under some situations, particularly those in which the system is highly saturated with regard to phosphorus, and there's flow paths that will take that phosphorus to the right direction in groundwater. And groundwater can have tremendously long lag times. So as a result, even as we clean things up basically above ground, that groundwater can take a long time to respond. And so the legacy phosphorus is part of that lag time phenomenon that people end up being very concerned about. I mostly pointed to liability, and it's really important to understand that we're dealing with a natural resource here. So we're dealing with a situation in which phosphorus is unevenly distributed around the globe, and yet it's this foundational resource for crop and livestock production. And so the relocation of phosphorus represents a tremendous success story. And so we can absolutely say that humanity has benefited from it. And this is the foundation of our food, fuel, fiber production system in the modern era. So it's important to be treated that way. If you look at this map right here, which Graham McDonald and company generated doing basically, nutrient budgets akin to the ones that I showed earlier from Robert Szabo's work. You can see hotspots all over the world. You see places like China where national policy is largely responsible for that accumulation of legacy phosphorus. That's seen as a way of building soil fertility, as a real investment in the national agricultural strategy, so the food security strategy. If you look to Brazil, you see the same thing. And so I'm going to highlight that right now because because I'm going to jump now into a brief kind of chemistry lesson. It's a light chemistry lesson, but I hope that folks will humor me and use this as a way of kind of learning about the legacy phosphorus issue. And so what I've got before you here is a graph that we call a phosphorus sorption isotherm. So it is basically something that depicts on the x-axis phosphorus that's in the soil water or some representation of the soil water. And then on the y-axis, phosphorus that's bound to soil particles. Phosphorus has an extremely high affinity for soil. So most of us learned, particularly those of us who are a little older, that phosphorus is like a nearly immobile element given that affinity that it has for soil, but it only moves when erosion happens. The science has long borne out that that's not the case, that is an exaggeration, and it's ignored the solution side or the dissolved phosphorus side of it. So to generate a graph like that, you take a soil sample and you basically split it up. You subject it to varying concentrations of phosphorus, of phosphate in solution. You shake it for a while, filter it out, and then you basically see how much phosphorus ended up in the solution. By difference, you figure out what went onto the soil versus what stayed in solution. So quick thing just to guide you here, you can see differences in terms of the scales of the graphs, of the axes right here. So you're off by an order of magnitude in terms of what's in solution versus what's in the soil. Our approach to fertilization, to soil fertility in the modern world is to try to add enough phosphorus or to try to do other things like to lime our soils so that we can reduce what we call the buffer capacity of the soil. So what you're seeing here effectively is two different types of soils, one with a high phosphorus buffer capacity in which a majority of the phosphorus is being added, ends up being bombed by the soil, and one with a low phosphorus buffer capacity in which our investment, our new additions of fertilizer, of manure, offer more to the soil solution. The soil solution, that soil water, is where crop roots get their nutrients, where they get their phosphorus. So basically what we're doing then, in the words of Paul Withers, a eminent scientist in England, is that we're feeding the soil to feed the crop. And this has to be seen as an inefficient way. It works. It's a foundation of the Green Revolution and the modern success story that we have, but it is not the most efficient way of getting a resource into the commodity that we're harvesting here. And so on the right here, I show kind of the why. So if you've got a depiction of a root, you can look at phosphorus, and it's basically its transport distance within the soil to a root. Roots essentially have to grow to that phosphorus because it doesn't diffuse at distances like you would see with something like nitrate, for instance. And so what we do then is we fertilize the soil to make sure that we have enough of it in the bulk soil so that a root that's growing into it can find that and not be limited by phosphorus. My colleague Phil Haygarth, also an eminent soil scientist from England, refers to this phenomenon of the Green Revolution and the approach that we've taken is one which has led to us breeding very lazy crops. We have crops that instead of seeking out the phosphorus, basically just can find it easily within the soil system. So what's the consequence of that? So one of them is actually this phenomenon called vertical stratification of soil phosphorus. So vertical stratification is the natural phenomenon. We reside, basically above ground. We're not troglodytes, and we apply our fertilizers from above. And so the graph on the left here from Andrew Sharpley, who really was the leader in the phosphorus world for so long, and whose legacy itself this project actually, partly represents, did an experiment where he applied several rates of poultry litter. I referred to poultry litter before, so that's that dry manure coming from poultry barns. And what you see is the accumulation of phosphorus at the surface and a rapid trending off of that concentration. So the vertical stratification ratio, which is a very simple measurement to make, and I'm going to drive that home, is the ratio of the phosphorus that resides on the surface relative to the phosphorus that's in the subsurface that's there. And so the more we add to the surface, basically more we drive vertical stratification. And so why do we even care about that? Well, first, the obvious observation, the roots grow down, right? So vertical stratification means we're putting phosphorus up on the surface. Our crop roots may not be there. Doug Smith, a close friend and colleague who for a while was in Indiana, did a really simple but elegant experiment where he linked the soil phosphorus. So here it's melic-3 phosphorus. That's a way of measuring soil phosphorus for agronomic recommendation. Linked that to crop yield, and first looked at like whether or not how the relationship looked when you just sampled it on the surface, so that upper couple of inches, and found really no relationship between the phosphorus that's on the surface and the yield of corn. When he looked just a little deeper, so just down to kind of our standard agronomic sampling depth, that could be down to about 6 inches or 8 inches, depending on what state you're in, he started to see that relationship. And so again, roots grow down, so getting that phosphorus a little deeper in the soil is where you expect to see a response from a crop. So vertical stratification is not necessarily helping you out from a agronomic production standpoint. When you get into the realm of environmental concerns, so of water quality, vertical stratification is one of these things that it becomes almost a boogeyman. And that's because the zone of interaction between runoff water, so this is water that would run off the soil and take it downstream to areas of concern, water bodies where it can impact, is extremely shallow. It's basically a veneer right on the surface. This is a really elegant way of presenting it from my friend and colleague Kevin King, who resides in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Ohio here. It's early on when he began doing edge of field research, and he offered me some of these data. He looked at the phosphorus that was in the upper couple of inches. Again, it's that same value, that melic-3 value for phosphorus, and related to the concentration of phosphorus they saw in soil tile drainage. So this is actually water that's coming out of the subsoil, and saw this very nice relationship. So this is borne out by other studies as well. And again, shows you that that phosphorus on the surface really has the potential to be a source to offsite losses. So for our Legacy Phosphorus project, the USDA Legacy Phosphorus Assessment Project, where we've got 7 sites, these 7 CEAP sites, we went out and sampled soils all over. We carried out this very simple comparison of the phosphorus in the upper 2 inches of our soil samples, as opposed to this phosphorus that was in the 2 to 6 inch there. And so the graph here depicts the distribution of vertical stratification ratios. So 1-to-1 would be basically that upper 2 inches looks just like the lower 2 to 6 inches. And as you move to 2+, you're in an area where you should consider vertical stratification to be of concern, where you've got a lot of resource sitting just on the surface and not down where your crop roots. And you can see basically at all sites, regardless of where in the United States you are, you've got some degree of vertical stratification that's happening right there. There's definitely a site-specific set of differences, and it doesn't distill down into the easiest messages, but there's some obvious kind of culprits for this. So if you go to like Lake Champlain, where you have significant dairy operations, you also have a lot of perennial forages. You can see that the repeated application of dairy manure to hay would help to exacerbate vertical stratification. If you go to the Snake River in Idaho, an irrigated area where my friend and colleague Dave Bjornberg refers to the practice of recreational tillage, you'll get commonly 5 passes of tillage on some of these irrigated grounds. You see actually closer to a 1-to-1 stratification ratio. It's a bimodal one for this Snake River, so it's not purely that case, but you can see actually tillage and the act of mixing reduces it. So that's vertical stratification alone. There are various things that you can do about vertical stratification. So the first thing is, if you can't see it, you can't address it. And I would appeal to folks who are working in areas, particularly where there's a water quality concern, to go out and try to measure it. So this is about taking some surface sample and comparing it to your deeper sample. I haven't defined it yet, but I think it needs to be regionally appropriate, 6 inches, 8 inches, whatever that deeper sample is. Certainly within the smart agriculture system, that 4R system, looking at the placement of phosphorus commercial fertilizers and manures, subsurface banding of manure, injection of fertilizer and manure, aeration banding. These are all effective means of helping to reduce the vertical stratification. Finally, there's this concept of rotation and not just sticking with what you're doing constantly. This is a conservation, dogma basically. So I think should be pretty well received right here. But it does mean looking at, say, rotations between annual and perennial crops. The introduction of soil phosphorus drawdown, going to go down that rabbit hole in just a second. So don't worry if you don't know that term yet. And then tillage, all these things in rotation can have a benefit with regard to reducing vertical stratification. So I want to kind of continue on. So this right now, I'm going to present two graphs. The first one is a graph that's obtained from the managed database. This is a database developed by Darren Harmel and company that really is an outstanding way of getting principally an edge of field data and mining those data. So if you go in, as Zach Simpson did here, and you look at the distribution of, and note that this is on a logarithmic scale, the distribution of phosphorus loads. And really, these are called specific yields or losses. So it's the kilograms of phosphorus per hectare, which is equivalent roughly to pounds of phosphorus per acre for those of you who are working with the English units. You can see from the literature, we've got a broad distribution. That little dashed line in the middle actually is the 75th percentile for the dissolved phosphorus observations, and it corresponds roughly with about a half a pound per acre, about a half a kilogram per acre. And I want you to kind of make a mental note of that. It's significant. When we start getting to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds of phosphorus per acre, we're in a realm of real water quality concern in terms of runoff losses. And so half a pound is a good area to kind of keep in mind as you're doing just a gestalt on what's concerned here. So compare that with the soils that were sampled as part of the Legacy Phosphorus Assessment Project. And now this is the upper centimeter. So we're talking just a little bit over 1/3 of an inch depth. So very, very shallow surface sample that's there. And you look at the labile phosphorus. So this concept of lability is actually something I introduced you to earlier with the sorption isotherm. That is this phosphorus that easily washes off a soil that ends up in solution in a soil. So the labile phosphorus stock in just that upper third of a soil is basically an order of magnitude above the 75th percentile. So we have a tremendous amount of phosphorus stored in our agricultural soils. And so certainly consideration of the transport potential, so what we call critical source area management, is really important here because there's a lot of legacy phosphorus that resides in our soils. And the different colors that are on the graph on the bottom basically depict the various watersheds from which they came. But you can see all of them are essentially in this realm of about the mode, the peak is about an order of magnitude greater than that 75th percentile. So I've been kind of introducing this to you, and I'm going to get into the conservation mode in just a second, so bear with me here. But I want to make the point again that legacy phosphorus isn't just a concern, an agronomic concern. It's not just something that occurs inside our field soils. And so it is actually something that can be found in an effective buffer. And so this is a literature review by Carl Christian Hoffman and company, and it's actually fairly old, but it's been borne out to now, where they looked across all the studies looking at inputs and outputs of riparian buffers for water quality. And so they focused on phosphorus. And with the chart on the right, if you go to the left, that means your buffer is working. Basically, there's less leaving the buffer than coming into the buffer. And the good news is when you look at total phosphorus, so that's phosphorus that's bound to sediment plus the dissolved form, you see the reductions in total phosphorus of 32 to 93%. So absolutely, buffers play a really important role in terms of reducing the sediment. This is as a result of helping to reduce the energy of the runoff, helping to diffuse that flow, helping to promote infiltration, assuming that conditions are right. All processes that result in sedimentation and can even result in some binding of the dissolved phosphorus. So when we look at the dissolved phosphorus, so the story is much more complicated. And this is important to understand. These are real world studies that are done here. That you actually have conditions in which dissolved phosphorus can be greater coming out of a riparian buffer than coming out than going into that riparian buffer. So the riparian buffer as a source of phosphorus, and that source almost universally is legacy phosphorus. So I want to explain that a little bit to you with one case. So as I mentioned, I lived for a couple of decades in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This is my dear friend and colleague, the late Rob Brooks, right here. We worked with basically a one USDA project, involved multiple agencies, to survey the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, CREP, as it's fondly referred to, its riparian buffer. So we looked at the forested riparian buffers, CP22, across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There's over 20,000 contracts. We did a stratified random sampling, so we went in and looked at contracts basically across the bay in the major physiographic provinces of the bay. And while we were at it, we just sampled the surface soils of the riparian buffers, and we came up with this finding that, like in places like Pennsylvania and Virginia, where you're in sloped landscapes, a lot of these riparian buffers are coming out of soils that haven't been heavily fertilized in the past. But when you go to Maryland, and I'm not picking on the Delmarva Peninsula, but it is a great example here for legacy phosphorus. A lot of those riparian buffers, those forested riparian buffers, came out of agricultural fields that have a long history of phosphorus application. And so when you look at that value, MELIC3 phosphorus, MELIC3, again, is this measure of plant available or agronomically available phosphorus in there. You see in Maryland, there's essentially in the riparian buffer soils, twice the amount of phosphorus is what you need to raise a crop. That holds true for a riparian buffer that's just 1 year, so just freshly established as a buffer, as well as a 15-year-old one that's just about to either leave the program or be re-entered in the program. So we found these elevated levels. That has to do with the history of land use there, that history of application. That is legacy phosphorus right there. So these are right adjacent to the waterways. This is basically the last stop for runoff. This means that those riparian buffers have the real possibility of actually contributing additional phosphorus to the waterways, which is not what we want to see with the conservation practice. So when we look at riparian forested buffers, they fall in this trapping category. I'm going to go into this in a second. There's a variety of trapping practices that we have at our disposal. These are all outstanding practices. They contribute all types of ecosystem services. They help with water quality. But with regard to dissolved phosphorus in particular, with regard to legacy sources, they can become a source of phosphorus. This is the headache for the conservationists, but this is not something that we just want to turn a blind eye to and shrug our shoulders about. This is actually something that we can do something about. And so I've listed a bunch here. I'm going to go into them in a little more detail in a second. So this is the what do we do portion of the webinar right now. So this is not a topic to be left aside and left to future generations, although there's certainly efforts, some of them, well-intended, to basically shrug off the task. There are changes and additions to practices that can be done so that we can be more effective at managing legacy phosphorus. And our team, our large team, has gone through, and you'll see shortly, the practices that we've been considering and that we're working with USDA NRCS on reviewing and seeing where we can do updates. There's also systemic issues, and I'm going to conclude with the systemic issues because this causes people sometimes to throw up their hands. And the systemic issues are ones in which it feels like it's not basically a problem that any particular farm or any particular conservation can address. The whole system needs to change. And so I want to present to you some efforts to tackle the systemic ones at the end as well. But let's start first with the practices. So spent a long time with NRCS colleagues and basically had this lesson, really reinforced, and that is conservation requires a system of practices. It's not just a single practice that you use, it's a system of practice. This is a maxim, this is a mantra that's there. avoid, control, trap. So what we call the acronym ACT, avoid, control, trap system for representing those practices is a very effective way of looking at the practices from a nutrient management perspective, from an environmental protection perspective, and certainly from a legacy phosphorus perspective. So I want to go into that right now. So I'm going to go into some avoid practices and some control practices, and then some trapping practices. And so for the avoid practices, you can see the ones that are right here. I've got a couple of summaries. So we basically, as a team, looked at the practices and how we anticipate them basically dealing with legacy phosphorus. So for things like crop rotation, range planting, double cropping, these are outstanding for avoiding future legacy phosphorus accumulation. They lower the nutrient additions. There can be a focus on greater uptake and removal from the site. They're particularly effective in critical source areas. So those hydrologically active areas that have the greatest impact on water quality, downstream. Same thing goes with Nutrient Management 590. Nutrient Management 590 right now is the foundation for phosphorus management and sustainable phosphorus management, nationally. I, in particular, appreciate the SMART system. That's the 4Rs plus an assessment component. I think that assessment component is so essential right here. And so that nutrient management then will help you, again, avoid legacy phosphorus accumulation by making sure that you're using basically the right forms, the right method, the right time, and the right placement. So avoiding those critical source areas, again, has got to be a central component to it. When we go to the control side of the practices, this is where we start to see a little more of a trade-off here. So I want to start first with cover crops, residue and tillage management. These are foundational practices for sustainable management. They're definitely trade-offs. And so I know that it is a concern, maybe even upset some folks, that they're not just a complete panacea, but this is well-established scientific fact with probably 40 years worth of observation to back it up. So for controlling sediment-bound phosphorus, so legacy phosphorus that's attached to sediment, absolutely yes, these are outstanding. It actually is much less clear with regard to dissolved P. And so rather than say sometimes in this case, I've just said that they're essentially practices for which dissolved phosphorus is not something that they're designed to address, regardless of the wishful thinking that might occur. Irrigation management also, in terms of controlling, is something that absolutely helps with regard to controlling sediment-bound phosphorus, particularly that kind of movement from furrow irrigation to sprinkler irrigation as well. But all these practices are great for reducing the sediment losses, so the sediment-bound P. For the dissolved phosphorus, it really depends. And again, here we're now serving as Mother Nature and controlling our rainfall events. So there are opportunities to improve infiltration. So things that are really going to help with the dissolved phosphorus. That tailwater recovery can be adjusted so that it helps to address the dissolved phosphorus, but it really depends. It's not like a universal benefit. Again, dissolved phosphorus is this headache, and it's one that just recurs as a water quality concern again and again. The trapping practices, I've already gone into some of them, but I didn't mention a few that actually came out of the CEAP, the Conservationist Effects Assessment Program. So blind inlets, phosphorus control structures, these are really designed to be part of a system that addresses phosphorus. So as part of that system, yes, they address the sediment-bound P, and they're specifically designed also to help to address the dissolved phosphorus. Some of the other trapping practices that are there, the wetlands, the sedimentation basins, the wascobs, wonderful for addressing sediment. It's got that depend kind of in terms of addressing the dissolved phosphorus. And they can also become a legacy phosphorus source as they accumulate sediment that has a lot of phosphorus attached to it, and then that phosphorus is released downstream to the environment. So they have that risk, if they're not monitored and if they're not managed, to become a legacy phosphorus source. Same thing applies to riparian buffers, grassed waterways, which we often don't think of as a potential source, but absolutely they need to be considered that way, and the various filter strips. So after this review that we did of the practices, the one thing that we realized is What's maybe implicit in a few and stated very generally, but missing, is soil nutrient drawdown, the explicit act of actually trying to remove legacy phosphorus from the system. And so this is something we've been weighing through, and we want to work with the NRCS in trying to get more included in the conservation strategies. So the objective of this would be to improve water quality and soil health by removing legacy sources of phosphorus for nutrient pollution. The practice then is to basically stop the application of phosphorus in commercial fertilizers and manures, to work to remove it. So this involves a selection of the appropriate crop, the appropriate vegetation to put in place, and then harvest so it's a form of extraction from the system. And then once you've extracted in that vegetation, really think through that sustainable relocation of that harvested phosphorus that's happening. So this is and then ultimately to make sure that you're monitoring vertical stratification. So I'm going to give a couple of case studies now, and then I'm going to wrap up with a few system level examples. So I want to talk first about some case studies that involve the use of the annual phosphorus loss estimator, so APPLE, as it's affectionately known, developed by Pete Vadas and company. And I'm going to first speak to our Lake Champlain site in a real-world case study there, and then we'll go to Ohio and the Western Lake Erie base with the second one. So in the Vermont area of Lake Champlain, we have Joshua Faulkner leading efforts really to help us understand options for legacy phosphorus management. So he's got a site that's been monitored for a while, in which under the current management of that site, you have a nutrient management plan under the NRCS 590 standard. It's operating within those bounds. The site right now is basically in long-term perennial forage, a legume grass, and dairy manure is regularly applied about 2 to 3 times a year. And so the dairy manure offers, depending on the year, 4 to 40 pounds an acre of phosphorus, or kilograms per hectare. So the graphs over here show year on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis on the left, you'll see soil test phosphorus. So it's first soil test phosphorus. In this area, it's modified Morgan's, and so that's a relatively weak extract. The numbers are pretty low for that. It's different than that Melic 3, which we'll see in a second. Then there's two graphs that depict the APPLE prediction for the total phosphorus loss and runoff and the dissolved phosphorus loss and runoff. So under current management, you can see where things stand right now. That 1 kilogram per hectare is right on the threshold of being a real concern. It is because the site is hydrologically active there's a lot of phosphorus that leaves the site, despite that legacy phosphorus level, that soil phosphorus not being that high. When you bring in as part of the 590 plan an option, manure injection, which is not currently being done, it's the manure is being broadcast, you see it really doesn't affect the surface phosphorus levels in the soil. Because of the way the system operates right here with regard to the losses, manure injection really doesn't improve the water quality outcomes much, either in terms of total phosphorus or in terms of dissolved phosphorus. And so it's still keeping basically phosphorus at the surface. It's adding to soil phosphorus, and soil phosphorus is the principal source of phosphorus to runoff water at this site. If you implement drawdown, so what I just presented earlier, and you keep it in this hay, you keep it in the alfalfa orchard grass or alfalfa grass combination, you see that you can reduce soil phosphorus. Takes a bit. I'm an impatient guy, so I'd love to see it faster, but that's what happens when you just basically use harvest to remove phosphorus from the soil. You see a reduction in terms of the phosphorus losses, and it happens fairly quickly in terms of total phosphorus, and you see the same thing with dissolved phosphorus, that there's an initial benefit, but it really takes time to start to get down to where you're having the current impact or current water quality impact to the site. When you try to accelerate, so I mentioned I'm impatient, so you put in, say, a corn silage crop here, you can absolutely accelerate the drawdown rate where you just move to a silage system, but you actually make the environmental consequences worse. You increase the total phosphorus losses. The dissolved phosphorus one, because you're looking principally at an impact on erosion, so sediment loss, they actually are reduced as you draw down the phosphorus in the system. But that total phosphorus loss means that you're going the wrong direction with regard to introducing corn silage. This should be a no-brainer for conservationists. If you add no-till to that corn silage management, you essentially stay the same in terms of the drawdown. You can significantly reduce the runoff losses, but you're still not even at the level where you are if you've got a perennial cover in place. And so the lesson here then is that soil nutrient drawdown with perennial forages helps to balance soil and water quality objective, but it's slow. And so that's just a reality. It took us a long time to get to this point. It's going to take us a while to get out of it without doing, anything too extreme. If we convert to corn silage, we can accelerate that drawdown, but it has water quality trade-offs. And so that's the real dilemma. But that is part of life. Life is just not simple. It doesn't offer the win-win solutions that we always want. We really have to go after conservation. Conservation is something that we work at. So let me kind of quickly go through the Lake Erie example right here. So we're talking about Western Ohio. This is actually a place where swine manure is being applied. Manure, is my understanding, is on kind of a minority of acres in the Western Lake Erie Basin. It's about a third of it. And so really the dominant issue is with regard to fertilizer management practices, but it also includes manure. So I want to use this as an example right here. Under the current nutrient management plan, you see an increase in soil test phosphorus. There's more phosphorus being applied than what's being taken off by the crop. The total phosphorus losses are basically double what we were talking about in Lake Champlain, and there's a major contribution because this is we're looking at a corn, soybean, wheat rotation of erosion or sediment bound phosphorus to that. When we add no-till, we're basically staying on track. We're still adding more phosphorus to the surface of the soil, so it's not addressing the accumulation of legacy phosphorus. But it is helping significantly to reduce the water quality impact. And so you see here the conservation practice really, really benefiting water quality just through the addition of a single practice right there. But you're still fairly high. You're above that 1 kilogram per hectare. If you include the drawdown then, so you're ceasing the application of manure at that point, what you see is without the addition of no-tilling, it takes a long time to even catch up to what you get automatically with no-till itself. But when you combine drawdown with no-till, you see that you really have now a combination that is giving you both a reduction in legacy phosphorus and a water quality benefit. And so what do these case studies tell us? Well, there's a site-specific nature to legacy phosphorus management. Any conservation knows that. Conservation is local. It requires site-specific considerations. It's something you got to measure. So you can't see this stuff easily. You've got to go out and measure it. And so looking at things like vertical stratification are important. I think the consideration of soil nutrient drawdown and vertical stratification has got to be front and center in any conservationist effort to address legacy phosphorus. That going after drawdown alone, being impatient about it, like I mentioned there, it yields trade-offs. And I think conservationists have this in their wisdom, is that you need to be looking at the best combination of things. And so this is really about working legacy phosphorus into that system of practices and the concern. So I'm going to finish up, speaking of system practice, with two major efforts that are underway right now that seek not just to kind of add single practices or go at things just with a few adjustments to farmer practice, but try to tackle the foundation of our current system. So one is the Fertilizer Recommendation Support Tool effort. This is an effort that's being led by the Land Grant University. There's over 40 right now. USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, ARS, others have all been extremely supportive of this. This is basically the land grants doing the federal mission. They're getting together and coordinating, making all their data very, very transparent so that we can reinterpret the basis of our fertilizer recommendations. The manure shed effort is one that's coming out of Sherry Spiegel and company, involves multiple USDA, industry, university groups, and I want to talk about that in a second. So first. So first allows us, by bringing all the data together, to go back and revisit the foundation of our fertilizer recommendations. Most states, all except for 3, and I've been told of those, only 1 of the 3 I want to identify really truly has a sufficiency approach. But most states have what we call a build up and maintain approach to soil fertility for phosphorus. So here's a graph that shows different levels of phosphorus in a soil and then relative crop yield on the y-axis. And our approach right now, this build up and maintain, leads you to maintain your soil phosphorus at higher levels so that you're anticipating the future removal by a crop. And this is really the foundation of our recommendations. It's very hard to change course because the data are so opaque. And so first seeks really to make those data available so they can revisit the recommendation. The sufficiency approach is really one that addresses deficiency. So on an annual basis, you're looking at what the crop needs, you look at what's in the soil, and you just basically apply what you need that year. You're just trying to adjust the deficiency that might exist in the soil. You're not trying to change more of it. Doing that helps to tackle the legacy phosphorus that remains in the system. You're not removing it entirely, but you're making a significant dent in it so that you're making sure that you're managing for agronomic reasons and you are removing what can be an environmental liability. So the other system level project that's out there is the manure shed one, and it's one that really seeks to go after the incredible gains that we've had by specialization and intensification of our crop and livestock systems that have also resulted in them being largely uncoupled. So on this really beautiful graph, the map on the left, you can see distribution of our crops in the country, and you see a hot spot in the upper Midwest for corn and soybean production. A lot of what's going into concentrated livestock production, so confined livestock. On the right, you can see, well, upper Midwest, a lot of pigs are grown there, a lot of hogs are grown there. But as you look around, there's other places where they're grown, such as in the Carolinas, in high concentration. But also you see that other industries are not there. So we've got basically a lot of our nutrients moving away from one region and to another. And so if you then go in and do calculations, and so this is what Sherry Spiegel and company did, and you look basically at a county level in doing this accounting at where do we have the most acute needs for phosphorus, that where could we bring manure nutrients in. You see that in some of those upper Midwest areas where you see the accumulation of manure phosphorus associated with livestock production is definitely not there. So what are the system level barriers then that lead to our not being able to move phosphorus back from areas of livestock production to areas of concentrated crop production? That's the manure shed. The manure shed is basically those lands that are around animal feeding operations on which manure nutrients can be redistributed to meet basically sustainable goals. And so it's a scaled thing. So at one level, under a 590 plan, you can look at better distribution of your nutrients on a farm to make sure you don't have hot spots like what's depicted here. Where conservation management right now is really, not designed and not working, extensively, is in when you move off farm. So there are areas around farming operations that could use nutrients. And so doing that in a systematic, sustained, and sustainable fashion is something that is part of the manure shed. So trying to address the technological and social challenges is at the heart of what the manure shed is about. You even get manure sheds that are beyond just the local, so ones that end up being regional in nature, and that's what's depicted here. And those are associated with major productions of certain livestock. And so real opportunities exist to work with, say, integrators to better distribute these nutrients so that they're a resource rather than just accumulating around the operations. So I'm going to conclude right now. So to recap, we've got phosphorus, legacy phosphorus. It's a resource for commodity production, right? But it's also an environmental liability. It has real impacts on the outcome of conservation, and that's at the practice level and at the program level. And we can tackle it. We can tackle it either through practice but we can also really go after it at a system level as well. But it takes, some dedication to do that. So you've got to measure it. And so this is where I think incorporating things like vertical stratification, making sure that you're monitoring not just ag fields, but also looking inside conservation areas like riparian buffers at what kind of phosphorus resides is important. And then you can manage it, but you can't manage it in isolation. And I hope I demonstrated that if you're just kind of focused only on legacy phosphorus management alone, you can have some real trade-offs. You've got to bring it into that system of conservation. So I want to thank the CEAP watershed assessment team. They're just an outstanding, this is an incredible resource, not just for NRCS, but I think, all of the United States and really internationally helps people understand the outcomes of watershed activities. The USDA ARS LTAR, Long-Term Agroecological Research Network, a lot of the sites that are contributing to this effort are part of that. And then, of course, the Legacy Phosphorus Assessment Team, they're listed here. If you've got any questions you want to reach out, you can reach out to me with the easy questions, and with the difficult questions, reach out to Lisa Duranchik. And so with that, I'm going to conclude the webinar, and I apologize for running just a little long, but I got my word in.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was wonderful. Lots of great comments, appreciating your effort in putting this together for everyone today. And we thank everyone who's attended. We're going to try to take a few of the questions because there's a lot of really great questions in the chat there. I know we're a little long on time, so I apologize to those who might have to drop off. We'll try to get back to folks afterwards if we can. But we'll take a couple of the questions now, and then we'll have a little bit of a wrap up at the end. So one of the questions is with regards to how much of the phosphorus loss problem can be addressed through in-field phosphorus management work relative to the losses from other legacy sources, including naturally occurring sources.
Yeah, so, and this is, I mean, almost a rhetorical question because the response is going to be, it depends, right? It's site specific. So again, I spent actually 40 years now, as I realize I've been looking at phosphorus around the world. And so for the last about 25 to 30, focused on it from the environmental dimension. And so in those places, like I featured at the end, the manure shed. And so in places where you have a high concentration of phosphorus inputs, so things where it's really accumulated. Those watersheds, a lot of times downstream, as you follow the flow path and you move downstream, you have off-site contributions that can be quite, significant. So in others, it's principally just coming from an agricultural field. So it's going to depend on your site. On the natural one, it's not that. There's certainly some native sources in places. You can go to the bluegrass area where Carl Bolster and company, work in Kentucky, and you can find native sources. But generally, it's anthropogenically driven. If you look at trends in water quality, if you look at trends in eutrophication, we're not talking about native sources. There are places where that's the case, that the systems have evolved under that. It's a little bit different. There is then the finger pointing, and I do want to kind of address this directly, that when you get into certain topics and an area where folks really are looking for win-win solutions and are dealing with something that's more intractable. So that could be even wicked. That manure shed one that I talked about is an attempt to go after kind of a wicked problem. You get this, and I don't know how many people can see what I'm doing, but I'm pointing both directions. When you try to identify sources, there's an immediate effort to deflect and point to other sources. And I can tell you from having seen success stories in areas where things aren't working around the world, it's in all of the above. And so this is not about like throwing up your hands and saying that it can't be done. This is about owning the contribution. And agriculture regularly contributes to eutrophication. Does it contribute fully? No, it doesn't. And so I gave that example from the Chesapeake Bay, where you have essentially an all of the above effort. Sometimes it requires system level change. And that's where I think it really requires large partnerships between government, between the private sector and other entities in order to see things move. but conservation can move the dial in most places. And so I can't assign, I actually, a presentation that I've done that goes through a pretty extensive literature review of what's assigned to legacy sources. And some places you're getting 60–70% of phosphorus loads from a watershed coming from say stream banks, where historically there's been phosphorus accumulation. And other times it's much less. It depends on the site. You can't ignore any of the sources. It really is an all of the above approach.
Okay, thanks, Pete. We're going to do one more question and then our wrap up, and we can try to get back to folks on other questions afterwards if we are able to reach you. One other question that we had dealt with no-till conservation. And let's see, I apologize, I'm trying to find that for you now. Do no-till systems typically struggle with phosphorus stratification? If so, how would you recommend managing this issue in these areas?
Yeah, so yes, I'd say no-till systems typically struggle with it. So their 4Rs can be implemented in a fairly straightforward way. And so in a no-till system, working through ways of the direct incorporation of a fertilizer or manure, so you're putting in the subsurface without disturbing the soil too much, is possible. And so I spent about 20 years in Chesapeake working with manures on different manure injection systems. And there are quite a few options. Are there trade-offs to this? Yes, they tend not to apply to as large of an area. They take a little longer to happen. So can you develop solutions where you focus principally on, say, critical source areas instead of doing it all over the place? Absolutely. So there's ways of making it a little more palatable, and you see a lot more adoption of that type of technology as well. You've got to monitor it. So there are areas in which you can promote infiltration. You can do things that will help to reduce the rate of vertical stratification. It's not going to stop that. As long as you're applying it from above, you're going to see that vertical stratification occur. And so as a result, no-till systems regularly, and this is a favorite thing for any master student, is to go out to a site and look at dissolved phosphorus losses from no-till. And you can see that generally they get worse there because of that accumulation. Even a cover crop at the surface is pumping phosphorus out of the soil. And then as the leaves senesce, as they lyse, the plant cells lyse, dissolved phosphorus then is leached out and is contributed. Now, does that mean you throw up your hands and you don't go after no-till? Absolutely not. So no-till has got to be part of an effective system, but you can monitor and measure. And so you can look at rotation. That rotation might be in the crops that you have that are there. It might be in the type of tillage system that you bring in. You'll look at all your options, and that too is very context specific. And so what you might see, say, as a set of options in the lower Mississippi is going to look different than the upper Mississippi, is going to look different than Chesapeake, Lake Erie, Snake.
Okay, thank you, Pete. For those of you whose questions we did not get to, we apologize, but we would love to be able to respond to your questions. So Laura had put her email address into this chat at the beginning of the webinar. If you wouldn't mind, we'll have your question. If you wouldn't mind sending Laura an email, if you can copy and paste your question out of the chat, that's awesome. We will be sure to respond to all of those that we get through the email, or if we know how to contact you otherwise. And I'm going to turn it over to Laura now to wrap us up.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you so much, Pete, for your time today. I learned a lot from that presentation, and judging by the engagement we had in our Q&A, I believe our audience did as well. So thank you for all your questions. And as Lisa mentioned, if you could please email me your question if we did not get a chance to get to it at the chat, we will make sure to respond to that via email. I also want to give a huge thank you to Casey Taylor for her opening remarks, and to everyone involved with the CEAP project that we discussed today. Once again, please visit the Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage to access the recording of this webinar, as well as the presentation slides. Both will be available by the end of August. A sign-up link to receive Conservation Outcomes Gov delivery email messages is currently available on the webpage, along with additional resources from today's presentation. If you're curious about additional NRCS work to assess and inform voluntary conservation outcomes for watersheds, I encourage you to visit the CEAP Watersheds Assessment webpage. That your URL is available via the chat, and don't hesitate to contact me, again, laura.crowell@usda.gov, with any follow-up questions after today's event. And we have one final webinar scheduled for 2024. It's also related to watersheds. It will be October 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we will be discussing lessons learned for water quality outcomes, conservation planning, and implementation for healthy watersheds. We'll hope you can join us then as well. So I hope you have a great day, everybody, and thank you for hanging in and a little bit longer and listening to our questions. So have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.